Welcome to Radical Anthropology, everybody, after our short break. This is going to be our second last talk before the summer break. We have one more next week, which you shouldn't miss. But tonight is a Radical Anthropology classic with Chris Knight, who's, of course, Radical Anthropology founder and author of Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture. And he is talking on the history of the menstrual hut. I think I'll leave it with you, Chris. Go for it.
Okay, I'm going to give a very short 1-minute version, and then perhaps a 5-minute or so version, and then the talk. Really shocking, so shocking that I don't know anyone who, I don't know, in any kind of mainstream anthropology department can even cope with this. If you take temples, synagogues, mosques, churches, cathedrals, and trace them back to the very beginning, the world's first such sacred place was a menstrual house. So that's the 1-minute version. The full version is, of course, in my book, Blood Relations, Menstruation and the Origins of Culture. And a really splendid encapsulation of the argument about the menstrual hut is was actually in The Guardian in 2017. And I'll show a slide of that article. It's by Camilla. If the body isn't sacred, nothing is. And Camilla put together the whole argument. I don't know, I don't think anyone has ever done it quite so succinctly. Okay. Perhaps I'll start with this very, very prestigious volume, massively cited and recommended, Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus, The Creation of Inequality, How Our Prehistoric Ancestors Set the Stage for Monarchy, Slavery, and Empire. So, of course, the origins of inequality is a classic anthropological topic. David Graeber and David Wengrow, in their recent book, well, first of all, David Graeber in debt to some extent, but in their recent book, which I've actually got here, The Dawn of Everything, really argue that there's no such thing as the origin of inequality, because inequality has always existed alongside all the various other things that humans can do. So asking about the origins of inequality is a mistake. But these authors kind of disagree. And yet, the odd thing about this book is that throughout this book, you have ground plans of men's houses. You have a men's house, a men's house, a men's house, a men's house, and they go back in deep into history and prehistory. And it's men's houses all the way down. And you look in the index, and it's got here, men's house, page 45, pages 101 to 105, pages 110 to 152, 201 to 202, 207, 210, 229, 295 to 200, and it goes on 550. Almost every diagram is a diagram of a special building. And of course, it's the special buildings, the ceremonial buildings, that are more likely to leave an archaeological trace. And that explains, of course, if you're an archaeologist, you need evidence, you need archaeological evidence, and you're not going to get certain things, certain transient things, leaving much of a trace. So it's men's houses all the way down. And then you'd think, well, were there ever any women's houses? And you try to look in the index. Not only are women's houses not mentioned, even the word women's anything isn't mentioned. And as for menstrual huts, no, not a mention. Despite the fact that these days archaeologists, particularly in North America, have been actually quite interested in looking at first American dwellings, which have led to remains which archaeologists can detect, and it's absolutely clear that the menstrual hut, the institution of the menstrual hut, is something which archaeologists can write about, can describe. So something rather odd is happening. And how can you have the creation of inequality if inequality always existed? If it's men's houses all the way down to the exclusion of any space within which women can gather in opposition to men. And of course, you have to remember that these things called men's houses, I'll show a picture of one later on, these weren't just sort of informal places for men to sort of gather and chat. These were strictly taboo to women. There were institutions, very often a kind of institutions through which a kind of terror was perpetrated against the opposite sex. The men's house in Papua New Guinea, many parts of other parts of the world, was a source of one-sided male monopoly of ritual power. Yet, men in their myths, and in more than just myths, and their rituals as well, make really clear, in the beginning, we stole these things from women. The original men's houses were women's houses, sacred houses within which women, to which women retreated during menstruation and childbirth. And the story is that one day, a rather heroic man managed to brave the women's house, overcome the terror that men had of menstrual blood, managed to take over the women's house, transform it into its opposite, expel women using terror. And from then on, men have held a monopoly of ritual power exercised through this thing called the men's house. The point I'm simply making is that whereas in this book, there's not even a conception of a women's house, the truth is that everywhere where you have a men's house, an explicit house through which men monopolize ritual power, it's not just sometimes, or in some cases, in every single case, if you look, explore and read the ethnography carefully, you'll find that the story is that was a menstrual house. And of course, I'm not saying that just because you have these myths there that we need to believe them, but I'm simply contrasting today's myths, which is that women have never held power. Women's solidarity is kind of, I don't know, really difficult to achieve, whereas men's ritual solidarity is easy to achieve. That is a current myth, actually. I mean, if there is a myth really of gender today, I would think it's more or less the myth that somehow male dominance is natural. And what I'm saying is that wherever men in traditional societies organize a monopoly of ritual power, they say the exact opposite. They say men had to coercively take power from the natural custodians of ritual power, which was the female sex. And every single myth, they're called myths of matriarchy, of course. The myth is that women have a kind of unfair advantage over men. Through their bodies, they connect up with each other through the moon. That is unfair. Men's weapons can't deal with the witchcraft and magic which women are able to use for their purposes. And so I'm not saying because myths, myths are interesting, but I'm not saying because this is a widespread traditional myth, therefore, obviously, myths are myths, they're not science. But I'm simply pointing out the extraordinary contrast between our own Western myth and these traditional myths. As I said earlier, if you want the full story, I would certainly recommend this book, Blood Relations, Yale University Press, 1992. Another very interesting article, which hasn't been discussed much in the Radical Anthropology group, is Andrew Lattus, an article in, there's a lot of interference. I think I'm going to mute everybody because I can see, I'm going to, can I just mute everybody? I'm sorry, can you unmute yourself? Those of you who need to unmute yourself. Okay, unmute all. Yeah. So Yes, Andrew Lattis. Trickery and sacrifice, tambourines and the appropriation of female reproductive powers in male initiation ceremonies in West New Britain. It's a wonderful article in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, volume number 24, a few years ago. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to just read out sections of that article, really abbreviated, because it gives an example of a men's house and the ritual of that men's house, and the myth through which men justify their power. So according to myth, this heroine, female culture hero, Kewak, she was breaking firewood with a stone axe when a piece of wood flew off, making a humming noise. It occurred to her that if she bored a hole and tied a string to this piece of wood, she could reproduce its sounds, thus creating the tambaran vaku. The word tambaran means a monstrous, terrifying, illusory figure, which nevertheless, despite being kind of illusory, is feared, and the illusions are so powerful that this monster is effectively real. So her brother, Cowdock, angrily demanded to know why women held the tambourine whilst men ran off nurturing children. So in the stories, as in all these stories, everything was kind of reversed. So men had breasts, women had beards. Men looked after the babies. Women went out hunting and doing, powerful political organizing things. And in this myth, Cowdock, as in so many others, was angry. One day he became angry. He realized that the terrifying spirits were just tricks perpetrated by women. So he walked to the tabooed area of the village plaza where he saw his sister whirling the bull roarer. It's this woo, 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 woo. It's a sound, I call it in my book, it's the sound of the blood. It's the sound you recognize. It's when you were in your mother's womb, you would have heard the sound of the blood, the heartbeat. And the bull roarer produces this rhythmic heartbeat sound, which is always, in all these stories and all these myths, it's always the voice of the monster, the voice of the rainbow snake in large parts of Australia, but in other areas, other mythological terrifying beings. Woo, woo, woo. It's like the sound of a wounded dragon roaring in its cavern. He walked to the tabooed area of the village plaza where he saw his sister whirling the bull roarer. He proclaimed that henceforth women were to rear small children while men would hold and feed the bull roarers. He took the breasts from men's chests and gave them to women. In return, men received the beards of women. Still angry with his sister, Cowdock chased her into the sea and killed her with a fighting stick as she struggled to get out of the water. The fear caused by Cowdock killing his sister led women to renounce and forget their former secret knowledge. So the current patriarchal social order is here constituted. This is Andrew Lattis writing. The current patriarchal social order is here constituted through a massive act of forgetfulness. It is precisely this act of forgetting that women must currently simulate back to men in their rituals. Though many women are aware of men's trickery, they must reenact this mythic act of forgetfulness when the ritual begins. They must run off in terror as though Vaku, this monster making this bull roarer sound, as though Vaku were a real being. The traditional punishment for a woman who discovered the tambourine's secret was death. So a woman who kind of saw men whirling the bull roarer, creating this illusion of this monster, the tambourine, if she came across any of the secret apparatus through which men perpetrate these tricks, then she had to be killed, usually by her brother, by the way. This is over large parts of Australia as well as Papua New Guinea. And this particular tambourine vaku has the form of a cassowary, this extraordinary large bird. The cassowary-shaped footprint of Vaku was cut into her hair, and the head, this is the head of the woman who found the secret, and the head severed and thrown through a hole in the top of the men's house to the women gathered in the village plaza. Men buried the bodies secretly in the bush or in the men's house, telling the women that the tambourine had eaten it. So in real life, in ritual, a woman who'd been found guilty of discovering some of the secrets, she would be killed by her brother, secretly, of course, and then her head would be cut off. And then as the head was thrown out through the hole in the roof of the men's house, this would cause, of course, terror among the women who discovered what had happened. And Andrew Lutter says, terror is still very much a part of everyday life. It prevents women publicly voicing the skepticism many secretly share over whether tamarins are real. Many men are aware of women's skepticism and are primarily concerned that it not be publicly voiced. Terror plus a proud allegiance to custom leads to a complicit participation by women in reproducing publicly the ascribed female naivety on which male ritual power depends. They are forced to enact and validate the ideologies through which they are dominated. This political simulation of herself is iconic with and ideologically inscribed in the myth of her being the origins of the powers of simulation, the powers of trickery. Women must enact and become subject to the powers of the illusions that she created. And I suppose what I'm emphasizing here is how Lattus puts it, that women kind of on purpose forget that they once held the power. They kind of know it, but they can't quite say it. And it's convenient for them to be very forgetful about it. And I suppose what I'm saying really is that this forgetfulness on the part of women, which is a part of the origin of patriarchy, the origin of this one-sided male monopoly of ritual power, my view is that that forgetfulness is still here. And the book I was mentioning by Flannery and Kent Flannery and Marcus is an example. As I said, you look through the book, you find all these men's houses. You find in the index the references to the men's houses. You look in the index for anything to do with women's houses, and it all seems to have been forgotten. It's a massive act of forgetfulness, and it's kind of not. Maybe it's not in women's interest to remember anything about. I mean, it has been. Maybe it has been in women's interest not to be too, I don't know, too knowledgeable. And forgetfulness is kind of a necessary strategy. Okay, now of course you're going to be wanting some evidence for some of the points I've been making here. Let me say, okay, when I say, okay, let's just start with menstrual houses, menstrual lodges. I mean, it's clear, very few images can better encapsulate the oppression of women than the image of a menstrual hut in, say, rural parts of Nepal. A tiny little hut. A woman who's menstruating has to go into that hut. She's probably all on her own. All kinds of taboos preventing her from eating food. She has to be kept in the dark. Her feet mustn't touch the ground. The sun mustn't shine on her head. It's clearly, it's a sort of acme of oppression of women. And of course, these menstrual huts are all over the place. A very powerful description is Maurice Godelier's The Making of Great Men. Again, another a Papua New Guinea example, where the men with these magnificent plumages and their powerful displays and rituals, who do very little work. Women do nearly all the work, looking after the pigs, the horticultural work, of course, the breastfeeding the children. And the men have an absolute horror of one thing, and that's any contact with menstruation. And down in the valleys, in the muddy valleys, are the little menstrual huts into which women must go. So, I mean, no one can possibly doubt the fact that the menstrual hut is a mark of patriarchal oppression of women, no doubt about it. But of course, what I'm arguing is that actually the institution of the menstrual hut or the menstrual house, actually that was not itself a male invention. My argument in my book is that women themselves, going back far enough to hunter-gatherer women, especially in Africa, where hunter-gatherers, even to this day, are not only egalitarian in a general sense, but are gender egalitarian. You find that women's need to be set apart while menstruating is actually a source of the sacredness of their bodies and a source of their solidarity. And in some cases, when women do menstruate, young women come of age and menstruate for the first time, they go into a hut. And there's absolutely no question. This is a source of pride, of joy, of solidarity, of power. And perhaps I'll just to illustrate this, now go to an example. The anthropologist Colin Turnbull, and again, for anyone here who's relatively new to anthropology, or perhaps even more to the point, new to hunter-gatherer ethnography, this is from a marvelous classic of anthropology, The Forest People by Colin Turnbull. And he was working with the Bambuti people, hunter-gatherers, in the northeast part of the Congo Basin, the Congo rainforest. And he was struck by the contrast between Bantu villagers' ideas about menstruation and those of the forest-dwelling Bambuti. According to the villagers, menstrual blood signified pollution and death. It was something to be feared. Among their hunter-gatherer neighbors, everything was completely different, and Turnbull describes the Elima ritual, a girl's first menstruation ceremony, and he described it as one of the most joyful occasions experienced by the entire community. It's actually the major ritual, and this isn't cherry picking on one particular example. Throughout Africa, where you have hunter-gatherers, the major rituals are not boys' initiation rituals. They're ceremonies to celebrate a girl's first menstruation. So we have the Kalahari Eland bull dance, but many other examples. Not always a special ritual for the actual menstruation, but you have very powerful women's rituals of women's defiance, sexual and gender defiance of men, into which girls, as they come of age, get initiated. And invariably, menstruation is the mark of your transition to adulthood, and in some ways connected to this process of initiation into a women's society, often a kind of women's secret society. Sometimes it has a building, a kind of hut, and sometimes it doesn't. But here, I'll just read out. So when a young girl begins to flower into maturity and blood comes to her for the first time, it comes to her as a gift received with gratitude and rejoicing. The girl enters seclusion, but not the seclusion of the village girl. So all the way through here, we have the contrast between the Bantu villages, horticulturalists, and the hunter-gatherers, and the hunter-gatherers have a completely different attitude towards menstruation. So she enters seclusion, but not the seclusion of the village girl. She takes with her all her young friends, those who have not yet reached maturity, and some older ones. So she goes into kind of seclusion, but she's not isolated. Together, they are taught the arts and crafts of motherhood by an old and respected relative. For these people, the Elima is one of the happiest, most joyful occasions in their lives. And so it was with happiness that we all heard that not one girl, but two girls in our camp had been blessed by the moon. With the onset of a period, the girl enters a large, specially built grass house, the Elima, accompanied by her young friends and supervised by an older female relative. And maybe I should just stop here to just point out my argument. I'm saying this was a grass hut, if you like, but more than a hut, a grass house, quite a large house. It held about 8, 9 women all at once. It was the biggest house ever made by these people. And what I'm saying is, one of the reasons why archaeologists don't find women's houses is because women's houses were particularly prominent among hunter-gatherers, and they were made of grass or other materials, and they didn't leave, they didn't have foundations. They didn't, and so archaeologists won't find them. But of course, what I'm saying is the fact that archaeologists can't find things doesn't mean that you should then draw conclusions about men's houses or the origins of inequality. Just because you can't find an archaeological record, there's no justification for extending your your conclusions from just what you happen to be able to find because you're an archaeologist. Anyway, just to carry on with this, day after day, the women sing inside the house. From time to time, one or more will suddenly burst out to chase a boy chosen from among the many likely to have gathered round. So what's happening is the boys get this exciting news that a new young girl has kind of come into circulation. And for obvious reasons, the boys are pretty excited by this. And they all gather round, hoping to get a glimpse of the girl. But what happens is the girls carry saplings used to playfully whip their chosen victim. To be whipped establishes an obligation to visit your assailant in the Alima house. Once inside, there is no need to do anything further, but the young man is subject to considerable attention if he refuses. And just because that's not all that clear, Turnbull is being a bit careful here. What happens is the girls rush out of their house. Any of the boys that trying to get a glimpse of them is likely to be chased with these saplings. If a girl touches a boy, he's then honor bound to go into that house, and he gets a drubbing. Quite likely, his own first sexual experience will be in that Alima house. And of course, instead of you can imagine, he's being jumped on by a whole bunch of women. So his experience of his first sex isn't going to be like, you know, a kind of machismo. He's not going to be the man in charge of things. He's being enjoyed. I mean, here he doesn't have to do anything further, but the girls are very interested to be piling on him. And a boy who consents to sex inside the house, this is carrying on with a quote from Turnbull, cannot then leave. He must stay in the Alima for several nights until the festival is over. To prove himself fully acceptable to the women, his final task will be to kill and bring home a large antelope. So for both girls and boys, the Alima ritual is a form of initiation into adult sexual life. For girls, it involves entering a special house where blood flows and bodies are merged into one. For boys, it involves a series of tests, one of which is to be accepting of the sexual demands of I'm kind of paraphrasing here, a group of well-organized women celebrating a girl's first menstruation. And so it seems that what Turnbull tells us, that these women will be fairly close relatives of each captive boy, perhaps in the category of aunt, cousin, or even grandmother, and that in the darkness they will freely express their sexual desire. But what we know is that the girls then get a bit fed up with the local boys, and they take their whips and they go looking for boys further afield. And now a boy that they now managed to catch is now he's now on a bound to go back to the Alima house, and in this case he's more distantly related, and he's more likely to end up being the sexual partner of the girl. I mean, the point I'm simply making here is that the house itself is a center of power for the women. You can call it a women's house if you like. And perhaps just think about it. Think about churches. They're dark, they're enclosed, they're quiet. In Christianity, but actually in many other religions, of course, there's quite a lot of blood. In Christianity, it's the blood of Jesus, it's symbolic blood, and of course it's the wine. In other religions, of course, it's the blood of sacrifice, a goat, some animal. But I just think, it's through the blood that you're united in solidarity in this enclosed building in the dark. And I'm inviting you to picture, even superficially, the kind of structural similarity between entering a menstrual house, which is a source of women's solidarity. Think of the intimacy of being one with the spirit, in this case with the moon's blessing, with the women, the two women's in this case of blood, and then think of in my case, I was brought up a Catholic, so this is my body, this is my blood. I'm used to the idea that you're one with divinity, and particularly one with divinity through the blood. So I'm trying to make the point that although it's a shocking thought to these patriarchal religions, all of them, it isn't logically inconceivable. You can see immediately, I hope, a number of parallels between what goes on in a communal menstrual hut and what goes on in a men's house. And now, okay, now for an even more I suppose, powerful example of communal menstrual house much more recently. This is 2001. Win Maggie, an anthropology who describes what happens regularly to this day inside the Bashali, a communal menstrual house used by women among the Kalasha people of northwest Pakistan. So I'm now describing, Pakistan is not a place where too many women's houses exist. They're mostly, obviously, men's houses, if you like, mosques. But here we have an exception. And Win Maggie was so surprised at what she found that she feared that her Western readers might not believe her. So she writes, "I don't want to make the mistake of leading you to believe that women always achieve mystic solidarity simply by virtue of sharing time in the menstrual house. Yet one of the delightful things for me, at least, is that for a few days, women whose paths otherwise rarely cross find things in common. The Bashari is a place of intense physical intimacy where women share knowledge about their bodies that would be unthinkable in everyday life." So Win Maggie's book is called Our Women Are Free. It's a wonderful book. And now Our Women Are Free is something which men in this culture, in the Himalayas, in one of the valleys in the Himalayas, is Our Women Are Free is something which the men are proud to say. They say, our women are free. And women in the Kalasha Valley consider themselves free, whether married or not. Men are not just supportive, but proud of the fact that their women are free to travel, free once married to return whenever they like to the home where they were born, and most importantly, free to resist men's demands. In this community, there are no isolated menstrual huts. Instead, there is a large sacred building serving as a communal meeting house for the women, who see it as the physical center for their solidarity and freedom. Women congregate here when menstruating or giving birth, so that at any one time, there may be as many as 20 women inside, gossiping, laughing, and singing together, many with their babies and toddlers. And during their stay in what they call their most holy place, women compare notes on the duration of their menstrual flows. In the Kalasha Valley, where there are no men's houses or temples, the communal menstrual house is the most sacred building there is. And so, to my mind, it qualifies as a church or temple, showing where the very idea of such an institution originally comes from. The Bashali building is off limits to men and provides a period of refuge and reprieve extending over several days. Women who want to get away from their husband for a few days can use it as a refuge. So if they're fed up with their husband, they can go to this women's house, this women's sacred almost temple. And when Maggie relates how a young woman who planned to elope used the excuse of menstruation as a pretext for leaving her family, confident in the support and solidarity she would find. So you're having an argument with your husband, you say you're menstruating, you've got to go to the house. And of course, you find this immense amount of female solidarity and support to enable you to make a decision. And if she wants to pack in her husband and form another relationship, there's very little a man can do. And Win Maggie describes graphically how women enjoy the intimacy of sleeping together in the Bashali, arms and legs wrapped closely together. Exactly what happens in the Bashali is women's secret, so much so that men don't even have the words to ask what happens there. The greatest secrets are the words used to describe menstruation, intimate parts of the body, and details of female reproduction. And being an anthropologist, Win Maggie herself compares these women's secrets and privileges with those so often monopolized by men in their men's houses. So what I'm saying isn't, it's not entirely new. And Win Maggie has, if you like, witnessed it. She's witnessed a whole culture where all the people have only one temple, and that's the women's house, and it's a menstrual house. And of course, women, are therefore safe from men's prying eyes, from men's demands. No man would dare go into that house. So I've given a modern example, and I've given a hunter-gatherer example, the Bambuti, and I think together they make the point. I don't want to go on too long because, of course, this is all very controversial, and it would be very nice to have some discussion of it all. I'm going to just try and show just a couple of slides by sharing my screen and then showing this. Yeah, is that now? Can I just see? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, right. So this is Camilla's article in The Guardian from 2017. If the body isn't sacred, nothing is. Why menstrual taboos matter. And you can see the subheading here. Menstrual seclusion was once about giving women a safe space. Hunter-gatherer cultures can teach us how women's blood is potent and not polluting. So I would very much recommend that article. It's 11th of February 2017, but it's, you can easily, if you just type in one of those, if the body isn't sacred, nothing is, it'll come up on Google. Now, again, on my screen, I've got the wrong, why is this? Oh yeah, okay, I can move it, that's good. So this is a Nepalese menstrual hut. And on the right, I've just got this, sorry, on the right, I don't quite know why my screen is, why is it? It's kind of off, anyway. Quite recently in Nepal, there's been a ban on menstrual huts. Very understandably, no way am I saying that these particular kinds of menstrual huts are sites of women's solidarity, quite the opposite. But it's the text underneath in this magazine, Women and Girls, Nepal has banned the practice of banishing menstruating women and girls to sheds. Activists have welcomed the new law, but say there is more work to be done. And I've just got this up here just to make the point that this is the point. When patriarchy takes over, what it does is it transforms what was once the menstrual house of power and solidarity, making sure that women are isolated when they menstruate, making sure that the menstrual house that women have to go into is a small building, very often in a valley that nobody wants to go to, while the men expand their version of the menstrual house into what's called a men's house, which the archaeologists can easily just see over time turns into the temple, the mosque, the church, the cathedral, the synagogue, and so forth. So you get this bifurcation with the women's version of the menstrual house getting smaller and more marginalized, and women feeling more and more oppressed in there, even though, of course, the tradition is very strong. And sometimes, no doubt about it, sometimes the descriptions of the oppression are overstated, I'm sure sometimes understated, but all I'm saying is that women very often in some of these cultures, they actually want a break from men's demands and from family demands. And in some cases, there's something in it for women in the sense of, when you're in your period, maybe you don't want to be cooking the food and mending your husband's socks and giving him sex and stuff. There might be all sorts of reasons why it's sort of give us a break is kind of a way of describing women's feelings. But still, clearly, this is, in this case, looking at this picture, this is oppression, female oppression. And this is just, the reason I've got this is that if you look on Wikipedia, you've got this little description of the Kalasha. Now, I've been describing the Kalasha, having read Win Maggie's book, but here we have kind of the usual assumption. In contrast to the surrounding Pakistani culture, the Kalasha do not in general separate males and females or frown on contact between the sexes. However, menstruating girls and women are sent to live in the Bashalini, the village menstrual building, during their periods until they regain their purity. They are also required to give birth in the Bashalini. There's also a ritual restoring purity to a woman. Now, all I'm saying is this Wikipedia entry, can you see it's assimilating the Bashali to the traditional Western image of the menstrual hut. It's saying the women are sent. Win Maggie did some proper field work in this part of the world. In no sense are women sent to the Bashalani. Women want to be there. That's where they find their solidarity, where they celebrate their power as women. And giving birth in that place with other women is actually empowering compared with having to give birth maybe with your husband without women's active support. And the idea of impurity, again, it's so clear that the whole idea of impurity is not with the Bashali and with the, as we saw, as I read out from Colin Turnbull, if something's holy, if your body is holy and marked as sacred by your blood, if you're a woman marked as sacred by your blood, then what's impure is contact with the opposite sex at an inappropriate period of time. So what's impure is the mixing of opposites, but the blood itself isn't considered to be impure. Now, of course, under a patriarchal culture, this gets changed, and menstrual blood itself becomes polluting, impure, and all the positives, which I've discussed from the previous examples, get turned into negatives under patriarchy. So this is just a lovely picture. These are the Kashali women. Incredible amount of solidarity. Wherever you read about these people, there's always the women are together. The older women are very, very proud, beautifully dressed, constantly together with each other, having this base, this so-called menstrual house. Here again, this picture was on Camilla's article in The Guardian. This is just there's actually a rather nice film you can find on Google this is actually a clip from a video of women inside this menstrual house. Yes, doing housework, but they're doing it for themselves as well as the childcare for themselves. There's no sense in which they're doing these jobs for men. And then finally, I've just got this picture. This is the Kent Flannery Joyce Marcus, and down here I've just got this strange thing, which I've described as following Andrew Lattice as an act of forgetfulness. You've got men's house, men's house, men's house, men's house. Almost every illustration is a picture of a men's house, and yet the book's called The Creation of Inequality. And I'm saying, how can you? What does that mean? I mean, according to this book, men always were the sex that had the ritual power and the house or lodge through which that power was exercised. How can you talk about the creation of inequality if it's men's houses all the way down? So for the moment, that's it. But luckily, Camilla is here. And I think Camilla will be wanting to say, at least I hope she's going to be wanting to say a few things as well, because there's quite a lot of quite ingenious biological, anthropological studies of some of these topics. So, okay, thanks.
Did you want me to chip in now, or what?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I mean, I could talk a bit, because there is clearly this ambivalence, real ambivalence. No question about it. With hunter-gatherers and many other cultures, women are finding big solidarity in their menstrual huts. But on the other hand, there are case studies where the argument is that the menstrual hut may be an instrument of patriarchal control. And one of the case studies is from the Dogon. Sadly, you don't have the picture of the Dogon hut, but I was advertising the talk with the beautiful mud. It's a very stately building in the middle of Dogon village. It's a mud house with beautiful carvings of figures with ritual blood flow linked together. It's very artistic, beautiful building. And so there was an evolutionary anthropologist, Beverly Strassman, who's done an extraordinary amount of work with Dogon women on questions about menstruation, menstrual synchrony, and their visits to the menstrual hut. And she gained information about hormonal assays to show her that when women went to the menstrual hut, they really were menstruating. No kidding, it was real. They were going there. And it only happened when they were menstruating. And of course, for Dogon women, we've got to remember, for women in natural fertility populations, they will menstruate a lot less than women in the West, in a Western lifestyle, because they have much longer periods breastfeeding, having many more children, generally speaking, than most Western women. So menstruation's much less of the time. And so menstruation really marks out when a woman might be fertile. And therefore, if a woman's visiting the hut, it's kind of rendering that visible. It makes that amplified, the fact that she's coming up to her fertility, and she's going to be in that hut. So Strassman made an argument. She's an evolutionary Darwinian anthropologist, and she made an argument from a very patriarchal kind of point of view that what's happening is doggone men are kind of monitoring their wives' fertility by checking out when they're going to the menstrual hut. Some doggone men are polygynous, and so they might miss, they might not know about their wives menstruating, but by forcing them to go to the hut, they're kind of checking up on it. But you then sort of think, but why wouldn't it be better for men to kind of keep the information to themselves? Because the hut is right in the middle of the whole village, and it's kind of broadcasting to all the men there in the village. And in fact, the old French ethnographers of the Dogon who are in Mali, I didn't say that perhaps, the old French colonial ethnographers, they observed, this was Calam-Griot, they observed that when a woman is in the menstrual hut, she's resting there for a few days, her husband, he has to go and talk to her through the walls. This is called causerie des femmes. It's called chatting to the wife. And he's got to do that to prove his affections. If he doesn't do that, she is highly liable to be looking for other lovers. So you've got to think, this is happening when a woman is coming to a new stage of fertility. She's kind of advertising the fact that she's soon going to be fertile. And if hubby doesn't show his attentions, some other man will. So why are they advertising this in front of the whole village? But the issue with the Dogon is very kind of rigid patrilineages with very, very tight ancestry holding land. And for the Dogon of Mali, the cliffs in the Niger Valley there, up in the hills, they don't have a lot of farmable land, and the patrilineages hold it. So it's very important for the men of the patrilineage to know that women are having children by members of the patrilineage. So this surveillance that's going on is coming from the kind of the men's kin group. So it's really showing a case where women are under significant control, and yet they are also flipping that control by kind of exercising their rights to potentially other lovers. And there are many other cases where the menstrual hut can be seen as a kind of site where women can invite secret lovers. In the case of the Bashali, it's a site for organizing elopements and so forth. So it's a very ambivalent site of women's power or attempted male control that may not in fact transpire. Is that enough for now? I could go on for ages, but I don't particularly want to.
Oh, that's great. Thanks very much.
Mark has got some stuff on the mosquito. I think maybe we ought to ask Mark.
Okay, Mark. Where is Mark? Are you there, Mark?
I don't know if he can talk. Oh, Mark doesn't know about it. He didn't tell us.
Oh, I see. All right.
He hasn't got evidence, so he's just saying about the mosquito.
Hello? Yeah, I could talk. Sorry, Theo's got his thing on in the background, so I'll see if I can move from there. So hang on. Consemius was an ethnographer who worked in Lower Central America in the 20s and 30s. And
can we see your face, Mark? Is there any chance?
See if I can.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
I need to live.
Yeah, Consemius writes about menstrual huts amongst for mosquito women. He was writing in the 1930s, but he doesn't have much to say about. He doesn't have anything to say about the reasons for the existence of these huts. It says that quite often an older woman would come in and help the younger woman with whatever she needed and so on. And men were expressly forbidden to enter. But beyond that, it doesn't really say much. And in my own work, I haven't found anything like that. I mean, there are amongst the Miskito menstrual taboos that are, you know, similar to those found in many other places of the world, but I haven't found anything on menstrual huts, and I haven't seen anything like that reported among ethnographers who've been working with the Miskito since Gonzines' time.
Wow.
So as I say, I mean, it's about 2 or 3 paragraphs and not much else. So it's frustratingly not very much there, but yeah.
That's all. That's enough. I can't see myself any hands up. There should be absolute fury from all sorts of people, because it's a very, very, very controversial thought that the first temples were menstrual huts. And
well, there was some nice contributions in the chat, and Nicola was talking about her experiences of, or not her own, but experiences of Tonga people, her husband from Zambia being Tonga. And Nicola, can you say anything about it? Talking about young women going with older women and relatives to very secluded areas during menstruation, and that this was a very positive experience, not a separation for reasons of shame and stigma and so forth. There are still examples of menstrual seclusion happening in areas of Africa that can be experienced pretty positively, I believe. Mary, you want to talk?
Right, thank you so much. In Win Maggie's book, Our Women Are Free, there was this wonderful sentence saying that all custom involving personal inconvenience on the part of the new mother, because in the Bashali there is giving birth as well, there is menstruation and then there is giving birth. But then that one woman, or one woman, only one woman asserted a right to choose not to follow some of the customs, they very quickly fell out of fashion. So I had really liked that, because there is a goddess, there is the icon of a goddess in the Bashali. It's a very, very sacred place. And there is so many things that can be done and that they can't be done, and objects that can be brought in but not be brought out. And there is a lot of things. But sometimes the women decide to just drop something to make it a little bit easier on themselves. So about the comparison with the church, I had never heard of that from the church as we know it, where the more inconvenience, the better. It has to be really costly for the participant that he prove his faith. Whereas in the Bashali, I mean, they even smoke hashish in the Bashali, they wrestle, they tickle each other. There is loads of things that you don't expect. So, you know, there is still this difference of not being too rigid like in a patriarchal institution.
I think that's a wonderful point. Of course, the laughter is such a critical feature of women's solidarity in wherever you have it, wherever you find hunter-gatherers, where women have their own sacred spaces and their own sacred rituals. It's full of laughter. And what you just notice in all the men's houses is not a lot of laughter. And you notice the same, as of course, Mikhail Bakhtin was one of the great genius of all this. He just pointed out that all the bishops and theologians and all this wretched, authorities of the established church, the one thing they won't do is laugh. And so laughing at them and trying to make them laugh is the way to bring them all down. So lovely point. And of course, when you mentioned all that, I remember when I remember reading that in Win Maggie's lovely book, but of course, I'm also reminded of Jerome's amazing work with the Benjeli hunter-gatherers of the Congo Basin, where women have their ngoku, their own ritual, They don't exactly have a house, they don't really need one because they take over the whole camp, and the men are sort of banished for a while. But it's full of raucous laughter, mostly at the expense of not just of men in general, but of men's anatomy and sexual prowess and general. It's laughing at the opposite sex in some ways a way that the men find a little bit difficult, but of course the men just have to get over it because they're going to have their ritual, their own men's ritual sometime in the same month probably. So you get this lovely pendulum of power with each gender group kind of laughing at the other in a wonderful way, and it's the laughter that's so missing in all these patriarchal religions. We got Freya. Yeah.
And then Harry, and then Mark has a question in the chat.
Hi everyone. I'm sure you get asked this a lot, and there's probably no definite answer, but I always find it intriguing when we look at women's power switching, how it could have happened. I mean, I know you've spoken about forgetting and amnesia, and that they sort of forgetting of power, but even more than between different groups or tribes, I find it hard to imagine what cataclysmic moments in society all the way through the world split families so strongly, or split. I'm always curious as to what you would speculate the origins of those moments would have been.
Do you mean the origins of patriarchy, the origins of the men's house?
Yes, the origins of oppression of women, because it seems so counter to what's good for both sides and the whole community. It's not a question of men versus women.
So I mean, you're so right. I mean, I became committed to anthropology largely, partly through reading Friedrich Engels on the early matrilineal, matrilocal societies, but actually just as much from reading Bronislaw Malinowski's The Sexual, it's a horrible title, The Sexual Life of Savages. But the point I'm making there was that when women have solidarity and power, it's so much easier for partners to come and go, to leave each other. It's no big loss if you lose your partner. There's always plenty of other partners, and there's so much more sexual enjoyment. And so that backs up your point that actually men, if men like sex, well, patriarchy is the last thing you need because it just makes it very scarce. So, but anyway, just to kind of answer the point, the thing is that, I mean, Camilla's the expert on how it was that we even established that some things are sacred, namely the body, and with menstruation, the mark of that. But really, my own view is this, it's that in order for women to keep power, they had to be ritually in tune with the clock through which our species evolved to have a cycle of 29.5 days, and that, of course, is the moon. And not many people realize the extent to which the moon is the clock for hunters and gatherers. I mean, obviously not always, and there's another clock, the seasonal clock. You get summer and winter, or rainy season and dry season, you get night and day. But in terms of hunting, and Ian Watts has written a beautiful article on this, the moon is what matters. If men are going to stay out overnight in Africa on a long distance hunt, they need light to see at night. And if you go out with the wrong time of the month, with the lions are prowling with their excellent night vision, you're a meal for a lion. So you really have to pulse your hunting expeditions, and particularly in the past when they were collective expeditions with spears. The pulse needs to be the lunar pulse, withdrawing around dark moon and going out to hunt at full moon and coming back with the meat around full moon, and then having a honeymoon for everybody and lots and lots of sex as well as feasting until the next new moon. So to answer your question, when hunting and gathering was progressively replaced by horticulture and then farming, you can go hunting and bring back the meat all within a month. You can't plant the seeds and reap the crop within a month. You're now economically determined by seasonal change. And so what happens is the sun, the solar rhythm, the seasonal rhythm, begins to replace the moon. And in fact, the moon gets in the way. If you've got a man with his wife or wives working in the garden, it's actually kind of a bit of a nuisance for the woman to be synchronizing her periods in any sense with the moon. And once women are actually providing labor as well as sexual services for the men, women sort of going on strike once a month is actually inconvenient. And so the quick answer I've got, it's not the full answer, and there's a lot of work to be done on it all, is that for women to be really free, they need to be able to synchronize their menstrual cycles, or at least organize the presentation of menstruation in a way which is in some ways connected with the moon, with menstruation around dark moon and ovulation and honeymoon around full moon. And once that rhythm is broken in favor of a much slower ritual calendar, like maybe a once a year uprising by women of some sort, that's too long a gap, and patriarchy creeps in that long period between the rituals. Whereas a once a month ritual of rebellion, that's fine. That will enhance women's power, and that's how we evolve. We evolve with the moon as well as with the sun, with a if you like, a ritual of rebellion once a month. Women's uprising, something like Ngoku of the Benjeri, on a once a month basis, and losing that was a tragedy.
It's incredible, and I hadn't thought of the energetics behind lunar and solar power as well, and the spacing of ritual and the rhythm of that. So wow, thank you very much. That's definitely a good start.
Life, it's very unusual to have life on a planet, and actually that's not even the right way of putting it. We are a living planet. Even the rocks of the continental drift is all made of either present life or previous life. So we're an Earth, Sun, Moon system, and it is remarkable how sort of so-called mainstream science, which is mostly a large part of it, which is ideology, just leaves out the moon. It's let there be light. All the ideas about ancient religion is about sun worship and sun gods, including Stonehenge and all those things. And it's completely wrong. There's no question that Stonehenge and those other megalithic monuments marked a transition from an essentially lunar calendar to a solar calendar, and therefore a transition from gender egalitarianism, a kind of pendulum of power, what Warner Finnegan calls communism in motion, to a one-sidedly male monopoly of power, and therefore a static form of dominance instead of a pendulum.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Freya. Harry, do you want to go? And then I'll ask Mark from the Zoom.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, very, very interesting indeed. And it definitely, like, I guess there's two things I wanted to say. First of which is that it rings true with like a lot of like Melanesia. Like I used to live in and worked in Papua New Guinea and done ethnographic work there. And I think in Papua New Guinea and in Melanesia, what you get is a sense of like the women used to run the world but don't anymore kind of thing. And like I was initiated into a kind of one of these so-called men's cults in Papua New Guinea, and the imagery around that is very much around women's power, and it's around the idea that women used to run the world, and all of the things that you're told is yeah, this used to be women's power, we've taken it back now, and all of that kind of stuff, which is really interesting. So it's fascinating to see how that's transitioned. I can very well believe the kind of culture like that of Papua New Guinea, which is definitely patriarchal and it's based on gardening more so than hunting and gathering, has sort of evolved from something more primordial, more earlier in Africa. The other point I wanted to make is I'm interested because like my mum is a midwife and is very strongly feminist, and she's interested in the kind of work that I do with anthropology, but she's often wants to know about like midwifery, and I'm interested to know because my mum, being a midwife, has experienced a lot of kind of like, I don't know, like aggression by doctors and that kind of thing, and talks a lot about the replacement of women caring for other women in terms of childbirth and menstruation, that kind of thing. So I'm kind of interested to know in some of the origins of midwifery and how that's been taken away, I guess, because presumably it was, I would imagine, and my mum definitely likes to think that midwifery has origins in more sort of egalitarian feminist things. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to ask really.
Do you want to speak?
Fantastic.
That's amazing, Harry. That's fantastic. We should be in touch to hear more about all that. And the question on midwifery, sadly, Ingrid, who really has background knowledge for the Bayaka on midwifery, is not here. I don't believe Ingrid's here, is she? Which is a bit sad. There's if we consider an evolutionary perspective, there's little doubt that midwifery would have been very important in human childhood, childbirth, for most of the last phase of evolution of Homo sapiens. It's just because of very large-brained children, very large-brained infants, it would have been of very critical importance. And probably even earlier in genus Homo, there may have been some aspect of midwifery. It's probably got some evolutionary time depth, I would say. But then there really needs to be a lot more close study of hunter-gatherer cultures of midwifery. But often these menstrual huts or houses, women's houses that Chris has talked about, are very much centers of childbirth where women will be looking after women. So it is kind of reproduction, not just menstruation and childbirth included.
In my book, Blood Relations, I describe what happens in northeast Ireland, where women, this is possibly the most well-known myth in all anthropology, is the story of the two Wawarach sisters. And the story is that the two women massaged each other as each gave birth. But in the local culture, the men who, to quite a large extent, I think fairly recently, in some cases, gained a monopoly of ritual power, they're intensely jealous of the fact that women give birth in each other's presence. And the sort of, I quote these various examples of the male ideal is that when a woman just disappear, or any other female relative, she should give birth, and she should come back without making any fuss of it and get on with whatever she was doing. There must be no ceremony, no solidarity, no ritual. Now, I mean, in my view, there's no way was that a reality, but it's no question that men did feel a kind of envy of this solidarity through childbirth. And that's exactly the point which has been made in that article in the JRAI, the Royal Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute, by Andrew Lattus. He was saying that the thing which men most envy and fear is not just women's procreative power, the fact that they do menstruate and give birth, but two facts. One, that they do it or can do it or want to do it collectively with in solidarity with each other, and also that the first illusions were created by women. And it's a little bit of a story there, but the idea is that these tambourans, which are kind of illusions, are women's tricks against men. So men don't quite know whether women really are menstruating or not menstruating. There's all kinds of secrets which women keep, and the performances they stage for men's benefit are kind of trickery. So when men then organize their own trickery, their own tricks of deception against the women, they say, well, we're just giving the women a bit of their own medicine back. Women were the originators of collective deception, which is, ritual and its associated mythology. But it's all around women's empowerment through giving birth and menstruating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. And it's definitely, like what you see in Papua New Guinea in men's houses is the idea of like ritual bloodletting, but associated with this is like male solidarity and that kind of thing. But you can so clearly see how that is appropriated by more, more like historical things associated with women's houses, basically. Thank you for that. That's really interesting.
Let me Camilla, just let me say one more thing following Harry's there, because of course the stories are what the men say. They say in the men's houses and in northeast Ireland and in many other places around the world, where men have a monopoly of ritual power, what they say is, we stole these things from women. And mainstream anthropologists, almost universally, they just say, well, this is interesting, it's a myth. Maybe there's a certain sort of tendency for humans to think that the past is the opposite of the future. So if men are ruling now, there's a kind of some sort of cognitive propensity to say women must have ruled in the future. What I'm saying is that when men say we stole these things from women, they know what they're talking about because they are still doing it. Because what men do is they actually menstruate in their men's houses, and they actually give birth in their men's houses, in the sense that they cut themselves, they cut the arm, in some cases they cut the penis, of course, with sub-incision in huge areas of Australia. In many parts of Papua New Guinea, a massive amount of nose blood has to spill during male menstruation. So the men menstruate, and while at the same time saying they menstruate collectively with a lot of ceremonial, while saying women should never dream of doing this, something terrible will happen. They'll get swallowed by some monster, some snake or something, if women were to menstruate in solidarity. And not only do the men menstruate, they give birth. Because the short version of all these stories is that all women do is they give birth to flesh. Well, that's not enough, is it? You've got to have spirit. And that means men have got to get this flesh from the women when the boys have reached the age of 9 or 12 or whatever age it is. And then they've got to go through rebirth. So that a proper man has been twice born. Once the flesh from a woman, that's all women can manage, is producing flesh. But actual spirit needs male intervention. And then you think of Christianity and all those things about baptism and all the rest of it. And you just see it's the same story. So when I say that these stories are true, they're not really about prehistory. They don't have a concept of prehistory. What they're saying is we stole these tricks from women. They know what they're doing, and the reason they know what they're doing is because it's in the present. They are still doing it. They are menstruating and giving birth. When men give birth and menstruate, you know it's a trick.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to the Zoom chat now. Mark Pizzato, can you speak, or do you want me to read a question? Maybe I'll read it.
Yes, I'll speak. Thank you. Because I've been thinking about the question some more through this discussion, and maybe some of the details I put in my question help to focus the answer. But I myself am researching European churches and Chinese temples through a performance studies and anthropological view. So I'd be very interested in what connections you're drawing to the historical developments across various cultures, especially European and East Asian, where offerings to the gods or to God are the primary focus in the religious building, often in an exclusive area. So I can see the connection to, separating women or men in that sense. But it seems to be there was somehow a shift from the focus that you're explaining with menstruation and childbirth to getting on the good side of ancestors and gods in relation to hunting, weather, natural disasters, other threats. So I understand your argument, but I'd like a little more on the connections to how men, not only stole or tried to steal women's power through other rituals and spaces, but also were dealing with other kinds of threats and goals.
Well, just very briefly, we mustn't forget that hunter-gatherers, when they go hunting and killing animals, they're not doing it. The men themselves aren't doing it simply to eat the meat, because most often they can't eat the meat. So a man hunts and kills an animal, the blood flows, and that blood makes that raw flesh sacred in the same way that his sister's menstrual blood makes her flesh sacred. So the men have to bring the meat, the bloody meat, the raw meat, back to the women, to the campfire, who then cook it and thereby remove the blood, rendering that meat edible. So what I'm saying is that it's absolutely right. You're quite right that in those patriarchal temples, the major ritual is one of sacrifice, animal sacrifice. There's no question about it. But all I want to do is just make sure we remember that hunter-gatherers had already invented the concept of sacrifice, in the sense that you're killing an animal and you're offering it up. The question is, to whom do the men offer up that animal? Well, actually, it's called bride service. So when hunter-gatherers kill an animal, they offer it up to the superior powers, and superior powers are the mother-in-law and the man's partner, because he can't just have sex when he feels like it. He's got to earn it, and you've got to make yourself desirable by proving yourself not just a good hunter technically, but a generous hunter who knows what to do. And so offering up the raw flesh to the gods takes the form of offering up the raw flesh to your mother-in-law and her daughter who you want to have sex with. And if you don't perform that service, you're not going to get any sex. Of course, you've asked a much deeper question about what goes on in the temples, and I don't think we've got time. But so long as we constantly remember that hunter-gatherers got everywhere first, and none of those concepts of religion were invented by patriarchs. I would say patriarchy invented nothing. All he did was distort everything.
You could say something about, in respect of Christianity, Jesus Christ as the sacrifice ending all sacrifices, and the ultimate menstrual man.
Yes. Well, okay. Okay. Thank you, Camilla. Okay. So the reason why, again, this needs to be written up, and I never got around to doing it, so I'm saying it now loud and clear so that somebody does some proper research on it, please. The reason why Christianity took off was because the Jewish tradition of having to, every time you killed an animal, every time you killed a goat or whatever other animal it was, you had to take it to the temple. That was quite a burden, quite a costly burden. So you couldn't just have your animal and then kill it and eat it. You had to take it to the temple, and obviously a huge inconvenience. And of course, the temple, the priests obviously had their cut, and it's hugely expensive. And it was, okay, it worked for a very long time. But the wonderful thing about Jesus, and by the way, I must really stress this. I think Jesus was a revolutionary. I think he was a freedom fighter, fighting for Jewish liberation against Roman occupation. So I've got nothing against Jesus. But what St. Paul managed to do was to transform this real revolutionary hero of the Jews into a mythic figure. And the critical thing that Paul did was to make him into the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. So what Paul says, quite literally, he says, what use were those ancient sacrifices? What use were those sacrifices that the Jews used to perform? After all, they had to keep doing them again and again and again, every month, every year, every time there's some hardship. If the sacrifice had worked, they wouldn't have to do it again. Why not have a sacrifice which works for all time? Jesus is the Lamb of God. He's the sacrificial lamb, the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. And the brilliant thing about that is it made religion a lot cheaper. It didn't interfere with economics so much. You could just go to church once a Sunday, and then you're sort of participating in this one and only sacrifice. And it just let people off the hook from this rather costly business of having to make a sacrifice of every animal you'd reared So what I'm saying is the history of religion. One way of looking at it is it's an endless reduction of costs. Religion gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So compared with, say, Catholicism, Protestantism is already pretty cheap. You don't have the monasteries, you don't have the charity, you don't have all the fast days. Protestant, you just got to believe. You've got to believe in the blood of Jesus, and that's it. And then you get today's religion with the Church of England. I don't know what cost is involved in being a member of the Church of England. You just go there maybe once a Sunday, and you wear the right clothes. I mean, so capitalism is completely rampant because any kind of opposition to it from any kind of ancient form of solidarity and sort of sharing and communism and stuff is just been whittled away until they got a kind of religion which leaves nothing, and people are free to be as selfish as they like, really. And that's the basic principle of the world. Whereas obviously the ancient religions were all about making sure that people weren't too selfish and made offerings of their wealth.
Thanks. Edward, do you want to go?
Yeah, I was just thinking of another example that you've written about, which shows this male appropriation of women's power, which is of course the sun dance in the Plains Indians, and the Great Lodge there, which is and now you've got the myth, you've got the actual space itself, and you've got the rituals that are taking place there, and of course the Great Lodge is so full of all this kind of menstrual kind of symbolism and associations with the kind of wet plants which they bring in, the kind of from swampy areas, the kind of the associations with serpents, and there's menstrual sex, which I think is taking place there as well. And then of course there's the sun dance, and you can really see how all this has been kind of taken over by the men. Sorry, not the sun. Sorry, the sun disk, where they've kind of taken over the kind of female cyclicity, female periodicity, and turned it into a kind of a cosmic universal, a kind of solar periodicity. So I don't know if you, I mean, if you want to talk more about that. It's just quite interesting, and I always think like trying to imagine what happened at Stonehenge. When you read about the Sundance, it almost like you almost feel like you're kind of stepping into kind of like a Neolithic, you know, kind of world almost.
So Stonehenge and Avebury and of course Silbury. I remembering Lionel's last talk to Rag before he died, when he talked just like you're saying, Edward, about the marshes and the grass and stuff at the base of Silbury Hill. So various archaeologists, they thought they'd found, I don't know, gold and silver, and all they found was sort of marshy plants at the very base of Silbury Hill, and then they found this sort of lake of red ochre. The whole hill was based on. So yes, I agree. I mean, there's a lot to say, but of course Lionel has published quite a bit of it, but thank goodness. So there's no question that both the Sundance and Stonehenge were markers of a transition from moon to sun, from women's power to men's power. Nothing else makes the slightest bit of sense. And yet you go to the British Museum today and look at the Stonehenge exhibition, and it's all about the sun. And as far as I know, I haven't been there, but Camilla, Eddie, and other people have just told me the moon isn't even mentioned. You must. It's like Lionel used to say, "It's the M word. Don't mention menstruation. Don't mention the moon." You know, it's of course in its religion. Religion is patriarchal. Religion is infected our universities, especially in this country. They're all once theological colleges, not so long ago actually, and one must not say certain things, and those, quite a few of them begin with the letter M.
So Ian?
Yeah, it's just going to sort of add a bit more to the variability within a girl's first menstruation rituals in amongst African hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
I mean, Chris mentioned the Bushmen, and what the monarchical rituals most famous for, of course, is the Eland Bull Dance, which is this great celebration of a women's collective, if you like. But what you mustn't lose sight of the fact that the monarchical girl herself doesn't participate in that dance. She is actually undergoing quite I wouldn't call it a traumatic experience, but she's not having an easy time of it. She's secluded in that hut. Her food and her water are very limited, and for quite a long time. I mean, she has this incredible supernatural potency, as if she was to look at a man, she could turn him into a star or a tree or a rock or so on. But of course, she mustn't do that. She's got to stay facing the wall in seclusion. She can't participate in the dance. She is alone all that time on a very narrow diet. It's only when she comes out that she herself is a celebrant, in a sense, you know, where she's giving blessings to the whole community. So there's quite a lot of, you know, it's not all like Turnbull's description of the Alima, and yet they are nevertheless just as gender egalitarian. So in a sense, and which, you know, it's not a problem for our model, because I mean, the point about initiations is that the initiate is paying a cost to become part of a coalition.
Yeah.
and that mustn't be lost sight of.
Yeah, there's an interesting point which David Graeber makes in his book on kings, which is that nobody's more powerful than the king, and yet no one is more limited in their ability to make any kind of move than guess who? The king. I mean, the king, you know, the divine king is, you know, divinely potent, but absolutely restricted in the kinds of things he's permitted to do, precisely for the same reasons. And of course, that brings to mind Sir James Fraser's point, which is that all the rules and prohibitions which prevent the divine king, the Mikado Japan. I mean, I've got it in front of me. I won't go into it. The Zapotecs, the Queen of Tahiti and Kings of Tasuma, whatever. They mustn't let the sun shine on their head or their feet touch the ground. And those are exactly the prohibitions of the girl in her first menstruation. And of course, yes, Ian, you're quite right. I mean, that girl who's become the Elan bull, she's reversed her gender. She's masculine. She's reversed the species. She's an animal, namely the bull. She's certainly not available for sex. She's, you know, menstruating, and all the characteristics of a divine king apply to her. And so the Elan bull is really the divine king. It's the horned god, or it's, you know, it's the you know. So all of that is absolutely necessary to remember. And of course, yes, again, there's no cheap way of signaling your commitment to a coalition. You have to pay some costs, which I suppose makes the Turnbull ethnography slightly puzzling. The girls seem to be having a whale of a time. Not quite sure what the costs that they're paying, but it's fairly clear that the cost the boys are paying is fairly substantial. I mean, okay, they do have sex, but they get quite a drubbing as they're having sex, and I don't know. It seems a bit. I mean, Turnbull said it's a bit frightening. He was chased by the girls, wasn't he? And he said he ran for his life. And the boys have to be, you know, the boys do run, and they don't want to be tapped with one of these whips, but because if they do, they've just got to enter the Elima, and then they're jumped on, sexually jumped on, as far as I can work out, by 7 or 8 women. So they're paying a cost. I suppose the mystery is what costs exactly do the girls pay? I'm not quite sure.
Well, just looking from the evolutionary perspective of FCC, the Female Cosmetic Coalition, the issue for the non-menstruating women is to make sure that any menstruating is under their control, not men's control. So exactly what Ian's describing in respect of the Elan bull dance, that a girl who's menstruating, and for Khoisan, it'd be very rare for more than one girl to be menstruating at once. It might happen, but it's a rare thing. Yes. So that would be a pretty normal response for making sure that the girl is undercover. Everybody knows she's there, but she's being protected. She's being walled off from any, you know, attempted male approach. In respect to the Mbuti, those girls of the Elima are inside Elima Hut for quite a long time doing the singing. They're creating a real community of the music before they come rushing out at the boys. And even when that's happening with the boys, as you say, the boys have to go through that. The girls are under protection of mums, aunties. The reason the boys get the drubbing is that they're being inspected by all the older women who are checking out who they are and what they're doing. So it's about this kind of dynamic of intergenerational control of the young coming up to newly fertile women. So that's a strong moral dynamic that's going on, which FCC predicts, yeah? And then you've got the Hadza situation where there's a sort of rather short peremptory initial menstrual seclusion for a girl by herself, but then the girls get joined in a cohort where they do go through some really costly ritual, but then get let loose on the boys to fight it out, very similar to the Elima. So we have got variability, as Ian says, but all of it's kind of within the remit of FCC, I would I would definitely.
Can I suggest, Camilla, you do explain to everybody what FCC means, and even say
I
a little bit
said
of
female cosmetic coalitions.
I know, but
Well, I mean,
have you got-
well, I was going to ask Freya. I don't know if we're meant to do. I mean, most people here know. If there's people who don't, you can look it up on Wikipedia and find out. Most people here know because they've heard of it before. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a very good explanation I'll type into the chat for Wiki if you don't know female cosmetic coalitions. But I was going to ask Freya to ask a question now.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So to me, there are sort of two areas of interest. One I touched on earlier, which is sort of historically, how did this happen? But the other one is, how did it happen differently through different cultures once it started to happen? So there's this premise, which I agree with, that the hunter-gatherer societies are much more equal. And yet we see vastly differing levels of oppression of women across the globe at the moment, in different cultures. And almost some of the ones that I suspect, I mean, like say Islam came in later and sort of took over Sufism, and some of the practices were even more harsh on women, things like female circumcision, which I know isn't in all countries, but is in several Arabic countries, didn't, as far as I know, happen under in Judaism or in Christianity. And I guess I'm wondering, given that in many cases it's unlikely, although I hope we preserve those hunter-gatherer societies that we have, that we're going to go back to the hunter-gatherer society, or at least anytime soon, what is the most realistic modern day way back into some kind of harmony, a more egalitarian, sort of energetic balance between men and women? And I suppose as a subsidiary question, I know they're both quite large questions that could probably be the subject of a longer debate. Why do you think that it played out so differently in different places throughout history, and even today is in some cases, I mean, quite horrific in terms of women's oppression?
Do you want to answer that, or shall I say? I suppose, I mean, Camilla's theory, female cosmetic coalitions, pretty much says there was one way of getting to symbolic culture. One way, really. It needed wherever a woman starts to menstruate, and thereby signal that she's available to be impregnated. Obviously, from a Darwinian point of view,
imminently fertile, not available. Yeah. I mean, yeah, imminently.
Well, okay, imminently. So, but she's bleeding, signaling that she's imminently fertile. All the other indications of fertility have been phased out. Ovulation has become concealed. And so it's very important for the other women to grab hold of her to prevent all the male interest being in her. So exactly what the kind of things we've just been talking about happened. So the short answer, I think, is there was one way of getting to symbolic culture in that form, and then countless different ways of sort of undermining it according to local environmental conditions, whether you could, just whether it's on a mountain slope in a valley, whether you can. I mean, Graeber and Wenger are quite good on all that, actually. The countless different ways of preserving some of that gender equality under some conditions, and then losing all of it under different ones. So that's not a very satisfactory answer. It's just like saying there's one way of getting it all to work, and there are countless different ways of smashing it all up.
It could be, you've got a constant push-pull dynamic of male attempts to control female fertility, female attempts to resist that control. That's going on all the background, all the time. With menstruation, because menstruation is a dead giveaway against the evolutionary background of our bodies for imminent fertility, there are basically two things to do. Either you hide menstruation or you advertise it. And we can see almost every culture chooses one of those things. And I'm talking here about real women's menstruation rather than the fake menstruation. So either you can just hide it, pretend it's not there, or advertise it, join into big groups advertising it. And almost every culture makes a decision about that And part of the determinants of the decision are the types of the forms of marriage that are engaged in by, and the forms of kind of marital exchange and the economic exchange that are happening between men and women, which are extremely variable all around the world, depending on economics and subsistence. And so take Christianity's form of marriage, its ideology is till death do you part. You're supposed to have one man, one woman, monogamy forever, yeah? In that circumstance, in the circumstances of Christianity with monogamy, no other man except the husband should know that a woman's menstruating. So you get this ideology of the scarlet woman. She's a scarlet woman because she's showing other men she's menstruating, which should never happen with Christianity because of the way Christianity's its ideology. We can argue about what are the causes, the economic causes Chris talked about doing away with animal sacrifice and so forth, about why that arose. But in those circumstances of monogamous marriage, what do we expect about menstruation? It's completely suppressed. Our model predicts exactly what we see with Christianity. A woman can't even mention it. She can't talk about it, let alone show it. Okay, that's what we expect. Amongst hunter-gatherers, it's a very different scenario because, or amongst the Dogon, who I was talking about in Mali, is a very different scenario because it's quite possible when a woman comes back to menstruating again, she's going to change her husband. She's kind of using her menstruation to advertise the fact that she's now ready to get pregnant again, to pick and choose the men. She's got a big value, huge value, and she is the one who's actually got freedom to choose, potentially. But of course, in very patriarchal cultures, the men want to control that. Kinsmen want to control it, or religious officials want to control it in all kinds of ways. So I'd say you've just got to apply that kind of lens to the very various circumstances that there are to get some idea, but it's a huge project.
I look forward to chatting to you about that another time, Camilla. I'm sure that'd be a fascinating one.
Yeah.
To just chip in a little comment there, which is like what Chris was originally arguing. I think it's still a quite good argument, which was that the material basis of women's solidarity economically was a monthly collective big game hunt. And that depended on the abundance of big game. Yeah. And as we moved out of Africa, by which time we were already highly efficient big game hunters, and we moved into continents, some of which had no previous hominin occupation, like Australia and the Americas, we wiped out the big game pretty rapidly. But it also happened in Eurasia as well. And it happened least in Africa because the animals had been co-evolving with hominins all that time over several million years. And what happens in those circumstances is that you have to hunt throughout the month, hunt smaller game, rely more on women's gathering, and it's in all that diversity that it becomes possible for men to take women as more permanent sexual and economic partners, for the marriage side of the equation to start winning out over the kinship solidarity that was originally matrilocal and matrilineal. And it's quite a simple story, but I think it's quite useful to hold on to when we start thinking about how it broke down.
Yeah, definitely. Right, if there's any more questions, comments, or it's nearly time to wrap up, I think. Is there anybody else? I can't see Ian's hand up, I think.
No.
Let me just advertise for next week, which is our last event before the summer, last of the RAG seminars before the summer. And we're inviting back Matthew Doyle, and his subject is Decolonizing the State, Indigenous Local Politics and the Bolivian Movement for Socialism. So it's about Bolivian mass and the influence of indigenous governance. And that will be very, very interesting next week. So please do come back, same time next week, 6:30, for our last RAG before the summer. And thank you very much, everybody, for your questions and thoughts. See you next week, I hope. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you.